Justice Sotomayor posed a question meant to test her, but Jasmine Crockett responded with a case that not only answered it, it made the legal world stop and listen. There were nearly 400 people packed into the Ohio Theater that Thursday afternoon in Cleveland. Lawyers, judges, law students, and reporters all gathered for the annual Federal Judicial Policy Forum. It was the kind of room where people took notes just to say they were there. The theme this year? Liberty, law, and voices that shape them. A title meant to inspire. And this year, the organizers added something different. A panel called Power and Perspective, Intersections of Race and Constitutional Law. That's where things got interesting. Jasmine Crockett, Congresswoman from Texas's 30th District, had been invited to participate. She wasn't a law professor. She wasn't a sitting judge. She was a black woman from Dallas who'd started her legal career as a public defender before going into civil rights litigation and eventually politics. She was also sharp, fast on her feet, and known for not sugarcoating things, even in rooms where people preferred the varnish of legalese. As she stood behind the curtain backstage, her assistant adjusted the mic clip to her lapel. She looked calm, but she was scanning the crowd already. "You see who's out there?" she asked. "Packed," her assistant said. "Heavy hitters, 3 circuit court judges, law school deans, journalists." "Oh, and yeah, she's here." She was Justice Sonia Sotomayor. Jasmine looked down, gave a short nod, and pulled the hem of her dark navy blazer. "Let's get it then." The moderator, an appellate judge from Missouri, welcomed the audience and introduced the panel. First came Judge Reuben Glass from Philadelphia, then Judge Lila Osborne from Seattle, and finally Justice Sonia Sotomayor, the most senior liberal voice on the U.S. Supreme Court bench, and someone many in the crowd admired deeply. She got a standing ovation. Then came Jasmine Crockett. The applause was polite, thinner, a few scattered cheers from students near the back. But it wasn't lost on her. Some didn't think she belonged here, not among federal judges, not next to a Supreme Court justice. But she sat tall. The first 20 minutes moved, slowly. Definitions, history, talk of precedent and constitutional framework. Jasmine listened, writing notes now and then. She didn't speak much at first, just watched. The air was thick with respect and caution. Then Judge Osborne brought up a recent ruling that stirred controversy. It had to do with how courts interpret qualified immunity in police misconduct cases. She argued that precedent required judges to err on the side of protecting officers in the absence of clearly established law. That's when Jasmine leaned forward, microphone on. Her voice was steady. "With all due respect," she said, "we've allowed the language of clearly established to become a shield, not just for misconduct, but for patterns of abuse that disproportionately affect marginalized communities. Courts aren't just interpreting law, sometimes they're hiding behind it." The room froze for a beat. Some eyebrows rose. Not because she was wrong, but because she said it here in front of them. Justice Sotomayor turned her head slowly and looked at Jasmine. She didn't say anything yet, but her expression was neutral, calculating like she was flipping through a mental file. The moderator cleared his throat. "Congresswoman Crockett, thank you for that. Let's allow the panel to respond." Justice Sotomayor didn't wait. She leaned toward her mic. "Congresswoman," she said, her tone light, but pointed. "You mentioned the phrase hiding behind the law. Would you care to clarify what that means, particularly for judges who take oaths to interpret, not invent?" It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge, a subtle one wrapped in civility, but everyone felt the shift. Jasmine didn't blink, but the energy in the room had changed and everyone knew it was about to escalate. Jasmine adjusted the microphone without breaking eye contact. Her posture didn't waver. Her tone when she replied was even, not defensive, not flustered, just clear. "I'm saying, Justice, That when a precedent becomes so rigid, it refuses to reckon with reality. It stops serving justice and starts protecting systems, and some of those systems don't protect everyone equally. There it was, a quiet gasp near the second row. A reporter's pen froze mid-word. The panel moderator leaned forward as if he might need to jump in again, but Sotomayor wasn't rattled. She offered a small smile, the kind that lives somewhere between amusement and warning. "I understand your concern," she said, "but legal interpretation must have guardrails. The Constitution doesn't adapt itself to emotion. If courts reacted emotionally to every injustice, we'd lose the stability the system relies on." Jasmine nodded, and yet stability without responsiveness became complicated. A few heads turned. Judge Rubinglass shifted in his seat. "This isn't about emotion," Jasmine continued. "It's about patterns. A system that demands exact same circumstances before it recognizes abuse is a system that will forever protect the first wrong and excuse all that follow." The moderator tried to steer things back. "Let's open the discussion." But Sotomayor raised her hand slightly, still measured, still composed, but it was clear she wanted to push further. "Congresswoman, you're a legislator. You operate in the realm of passion, policy, and public opinion. Judges don't have that luxury. We are constrained by precedent. That is not evasion, it's my duty." Jasmine took a breath, but not to calm herself. She was choosing her next words like someone drawing from a mental library. "I spent a decade defending clients who couldn't afford lawyers," she said. "Young men, mostly black, mostly poor, whose lives could be decided in 5-minute hearings. Precedent didn't protect them. Judges didn't know their names. And yet, the decisions made in those rooms shaped entire zip codes. That's not stability, that's institutional muscle memory, and it needs interrupting." That landed hard. For a moment, no one said a word. In the third row, a young law student whispered to the person next to her, "She's not wrong." Justice Sotomayor looked away briefly, then back again. Not dismissively, thoughtfully, like she was recalculating. Still, her tone remained firm. "What you're referring to, Congresswoman, sounds less like a critique of judicial interpretation and more like a call for legislative reform." "It's both," Jasmine said, "because what's interpreted can still be redefined. And someone has to ask when the old frame no longer fits the present moment." Now, even the moderator was watching the exchange like the rest of the crowd, not guiding it, just witnessing. Judge Osborne tried to pivot, offering a reference to a recent circuit court decision. "Maybe this is a matter of thresholds, how high we set the bar for accountability." But no one took the bait. The room was still watching the quiet legal face-off between two women who understood the law and the power of language on a level most couldn't fake. Then, Justice Sotomayor leaned back, fingers laced together. Her smile had faded. She wasn't angry, she wasn't defensive. But something had shifted. She was thinking, not about how to win this exchange, but whether she might be underestimating who she was sitting next to. But Crockett wasn't done. She hadn't even started showing her hand. Justice Sotomayor leaned forward again. Not abruptly, not with malice, but there was an unmistakable edge now, subtle and surgical. This wasn't just dialogue anymore, it was a duel, and the room could feel it. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, her voice steady, "you've made strong points about inequity and how precedent functions. But let's not mistake the argument for accuracy. Could you name a specific ruling? One that actually supports your claim that precedent is being used to excuse repeat misconduct, not just clarify legal limits." A pause. Not long. Maybe a second. But it was the kind of silence that lives between the snap of fingers and the sound of thunder. Some in the audience exchanged glances. It was the kind of question that could corner someone who spoke in passion, but lacked depth. A gentle legal trap disguised as curiosity. Jasmine didn't flinch. She placed her water bottle down on the table, clicked her pen once, and then looked directly at Sotomayor. "Yes," she said, "Vega Viteco 2022, you remember that one?" The room held its breath. "I remember it," Jasmine continued, "because it reminded me that even something as supposedly foundational as Miranda rights can be treated like a suggestion instead of a protection. The court ruled that a violation of Miranda didn't provide a basis for a civil suit under Section 1983. That meant if an officer failed to read you your rights and use that un-Mirandized statement against you, the officer still couldn't be held liable. That isn't about clarity. That's about shielding power." Sotomayor's expression didn't crack, but her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, in recognition. She knew the case. Jasmine went on. "You dissented in that ruling, Justice. You said, and I quote, 'Miranda rights are not merely prophylactic. They are grounded in the Constitution.' You called the majority opinion a blow to accountability. So I'm curious, was that dissent emotional, or was it a refusal to hide behind precedent?" Now that got a reaction. A murmur passed through the audience. The moderator sat back, blinking, like he'd just heard something that hadn't been on the prep sheet. Even Judge Glass tilted his head slightly. Justice Sotomayor didn't respond right away. She looked down at her notepad, then back at Jasmine. "I stand by that dissent," she said. Jasmine nodded once. "Then maybe we're not arguing. Maybe we're just naming it differently." It wasn't a victory lap. There was no smugness in her tone. But the room felt it. The shift in gravity. The crowd, mostly made up of legal professionals who prided themselves on knowing when the wind was turning, now began scribbling notes. Some typed on laptops. Others leaned in, fully engaged. One law professor from the University of Michigan whispered to the person next to him, "This isn't just a panel, this is a master class." The moderator finally re-entered the conversation, half smiling. "Well, it seems we've hit on something substantive." The audience chuckled lightly. Tension was still present, but no longer the kind that made people squirm. It had turned into admiration, the kind you feel when two minds meet at the exact right moment. Justice Sotomayor, to her credit, didn't pull rank. She didn't backtrack, but her tone softened. "You're right," she said. "There are moments when even the strongest precedent deserves to be questioned. It's uncomfortable, but necessary." Jasmine gave a small nod. Discomfort tends to be where the change lives. But for all the respect now building between them, Jasmine hadn't yet shown the real reason she belonged on that stage, and why Sotomayor, for all her brilliance, was about to see it for herself. The moderator tried to move the discussion toward public perception of the courts, but the audience wasn't listening anymore. Their attention was locked on the two women seated at opposite ends of the panel table. One at the highest legal seat in the nation, the other speaking from the trenches of lived experience. Jasmine leaned slightly forward, voice low but firm. "Since we're talking about precedent, let's go back to 2008, Ganfei, Arizona. Police searched Rodney Gant's car after he was arrested for driving with his suspended license. No warrant, no immediate threat, yet the evidence they found in his car was used to charge him again." She paused just long enough to scan the room. That case changed the interpretation of Belton, which had allowed broad searches of vehicles during arrests. The court finally admitted they'd stretched the Fourth Amendment too far. That's the thing about precedent. It doesn't mean right. It just means last time, until someone's brave enough to say it was wrong. Someone in the back muttered, "She's killing it." But Jasmine wasn't aiming for applause. She shifted in her seat and looked toward Sotomayor, not challenging her but inviting her. "Justice, I know you've spent your life honoring the law. So have I, just from a different direction. I've sat with clients in holding cells. I've read overcharging documents where the ink was barely dry. I've watched people be punished for mistakes the system itself taught them how to make. And when I hear people defend precedent like it's scripture, I remember every face that paid for someone else's legal comfort. It was quiet again, not because people were uncomfortable, but because they were listening. Sotomayor took a sip of water. She didn't interrupt. She wasn't smiling anymore, but her eyes weren't sharp. They were focused, studying. Jasmine went on. When I was still a public defender in St. Louis, I represented a 17-year-old boy named Darnell who got picked up for a stolen backpack. They interrogated him for 5 hours without a parent or lawyer present. He didn't even know he could ask for one. They got a confession. It was a lie, but they used it. She leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on the panel crowd now. I filed a motion in Ray Galt, 1967. That's the ruling that gave juveniles the right to due process, and I remember the prosecutor saying, well, that doesn't apply here. The circumstances are different. But the whole point of Galt was to stop adults from deciding when a kid gets constitutional protection. A few heads nodded slowly. These weren't law students anymore. These were federal clerks and appellate attorneys who knew she was speaking their language, but in a way that connected it to something raw. Darnell's confession got thrown out, Jasmine said, and that judge later told me, off the record, that he'd never had a defense attorney press Galt in that context, not once in 22 years. Sotomayor finally spoke. That case, she said quietly, set a foundation a lot of people forget. Jasmine met her gaze. That's why I don't. It wasn't theatrical. It didn't need to be. The tension from earlier had turned into something else entirely. Respect. Maybe even admiration. The rest of the panel tried to catch up, but it was clear who the room was focused on. One reporter tweeted in real time, Jasmine Crockett just brought the Supreme Court to school with case law and lived truth. This isn't a panel, it's history. Even Justice Sotomayor looked different now, not smaller, just more aware. She wasn't facing a critic, she was facing a peer. But what neither of them realized yet was that this conversation, this exchange, was about to leave that room and land in living rooms, classrooms, and courtrooms across the country. By the time the panel hit its final stretch, something had shifted in the air. It wasn't just about who had the sharpest legal point anymore. It had become a reflection of something deeper, who the law listens to and who it learns from. The moderator, trying to wrap things up, asked a general question about how the courts can rebuild trust with communities that feel left behind. He looked to Judge Glass first, who gave a measured response about transparency and public outreach. Then to Judge Osborne, who mentioned mentorship and judicial community programs. Finally, the mic swung back to Jasmine. She didn't hesitate. Trust doesn't come from outreach, it comes from accountability. You can't rebuild trust if you've never acknowledged the cracks in the foundation. The legal system hasn't just failed some communities, it's hurt them over and over. You want trust? Show people that the law applies upward too, that the same system that holds a kid accountable for stealing a candy bar can also hold an officer accountable for abusing authority. It was the kind of answer that made some people shift in their chairs, not because it was wrong, but because it was blunt. Truth often sounds like a slap in a quiet room. She continued, we love to say no one is above the law, but we whisper it when it's someone in uniform or someone with a title. That double standard, it doesn't just cost trust, it costs lives. Silence. Not awkward, just full. Sotomayor sat with her arms folded now, not closed off, just thoughtful. When the moderator finally turned to her for final thoughts, she surprised everyone. I've been in rooms like this for decades, she said, voice steady. I've sat on benches where I had to interpret laws that made my stomach turn, and I've done it because the system demands consistency. But that doesn't mean I've stopped questioning. What Congresswoman Crockett reminded us today is that brilliance doesn't always come with a robe. Sometimes it walks into the room with lived history and an open file. A few jaws dropped. The acknowledgement wasn't just polite, it was real. Change doesn't come from comfort, Sotomayor added. It comes from people willing to challenge what we think we know, even in rooms like this. At that moment, the panel was no longer about titles, it was about honesty. And Jasmine, she wasn't the outsider anymore. She was the story. Cameras in the back caught everything. Clips were already being edited by local news crews. One intern from a legal podcast had recorded the entire exchange and started uploading it under the title, Jasmine Crockett versus the status quo. But even with the attention building, Jasmine stayed calm. No victory grin, no chest beating. Just a quiet satisfaction in knowing she hadn't just spoken. She'd been heard. After the panel, people lined up to speak with her. Law students, professors, a few community activists from Cincinnati who had driven down just to listen. One student asked, "How did you stay so composed when she came at you like that?" Jasmine smiled. "You don't flinch when you're standing on truth. That's the difference between confidence and ego. Ego wants to win. Confidence just wants to be clear." Justice Sotomayor didn't rush out either. She stayed a few minutes longer than usual, talking to attendees. She didn't avoid Jasmine. In fact, she waited until most had filtered out before approaching her directly. "I meant what I said up there," she told her. "You've got something rare, not just sharp thinking, but a sense of justice that breathes, that matters." Jasmine nodded. "Appreciate that. I just speak from where I come from." Sotomayor smiled faintly. "Don't stop." But while the event was winding down inside the theater, a very different kind of conversation was starting outside, online, in barbershops, in classrooms, and it had everything to do with what just happened between those two women. The hallway behind the Ohio theater stage was quiet, except for the occasional squeak of dress shoes and the hum of someone packing up AV equipment. Jasmine walked with her assistant, still holding the same legal pad she'd brought on stage. She hadn't written anything new since the panel ended. She didn't need to. Everything she said had already been lived. As they turned the corner toward the back exit, a voice called out, "Congresswoman." She turned. Justice Sotomayor stood a few feet away. No cameras now, no microphones, just two women, in a corridor of polished wood and peeling fluorescent lights. There was a pause before either one spoke again. "Mind if we talk a moment?" Sotomayor asked. Jasmine nodded. Her assistant stepped back, giving them space. They didn't dive into debate, they just stood there for a second, letting the silence settle. Finally, Sotomayor broke it. "You came prepared." Jasmine half smiled. "Didn't think I'd be allowed to walk in here and wing it." "I didn't mean just the cases," Sotomayor said. "I meant the way you carried the room. That takes more than preparation." Jasmine's eyes didn't soften, but her voice did. "I've been in rooms where no one believed. I knew what I was talking about. Eventually, you stop waiting for respect and start building your own name." Sotomayor nodded slowly. "I've sat on benches where I was the only Latina in the building. I know what it feels like when people expect you to prove you deserve your seat, over and over again. They weren't enemies. That had never been the point. It was something else entirely. Two paths that had never crossed until now, both shaped by hard-earned knowledge and the burden of representing more than just themselves. I wasn't trying to embarrass you," Sotomayor said. Her tone was honest, not defensive, just human. "I know," Jasmine replied, "but let's be real. There's a certain expectation in rooms like that. And sometimes it's not about embarrassment. Sometimes it's about control." Sotomayor looked away for a moment, then back. "That panel's going to be watched for months." Every word picked apart. Jasmine shrugged. "Let them watch." That made the justice laugh, a soft, short chuckle. Not mockery, just recognition. "I worry sometimes," Sotomayor said quietly, "that the law is starting to drift away from people who need it most. It's all precedent, procedure, performance. You brought it back to purpose today." Jasmine tilted her head slightly. We can't afford for it to drift, not when we're the ones still drowning in its gaps. Sotomayor studied her for a moment longer, then offered something unexpected. If you ever find yourself in DC with an hour to spare, I'd like to keep this conversation going offstage. No audience, just two women who care too much. Jasmine hesitated, just long enough to make it clear this wasn't about flattery. Sure, she said finally, but I'm not going to stop challenging the way it works. I'd be disappointed if you did, Sotomayor replied. They didn't hug, they didn't shake hands, just a mutual knot of understanding. A kind of handshake that didn't need skin to touch. A few minutes later, Jasmine stepped out into the back parking lot. It was cold, not winter cold, but that Ohio chill that bites just hard enough to remind you where you are. She looked up at the sky, then glanced at her phone. 2 missed calls, 14 texts, a voicemail from a law professor in DC she hadn't spoken to in 5 years, and a screenshot someone sent her, her name trending next to Sotomayor's. Her assistant joined her by the car. People are asking for interviews, podcasts, legal shows. Jasmine opened the door, tossing her notepad onto the seat. Let them ask. But the most powerful part of what had just happened couldn't be captured in clips or sound bites. It was in the quiet hallway where 2 women stopped performing and simply told the truth. By the next morning, the video had already racked up over 800,000 views on multiple platforms. The main clip-making rounds wasn't dramatic or fiery. It was Jasmine calmly quoting Vega Vertigo, connecting a Supreme Court ruling to a human face most people had never heard of. The comment section told the rest of the story. She's not just talking, she knows. Why haven't I heard of her before? Watching this with my students today. In classrooms across Detroit, Baltimore, Stockton, and Birmingham, teachers pulled up the panel video to kickstart discussions, not just about case law, but about courage. In South Dallas, Pastor Elijah Boone watched the clip from his church office and shook his head. I remember when she used to organize legal clinics in strip malls, he told a colleague. Now she's going toe-to-toe with Supreme Court justices. The ripple effect kept spreading. Legal forums filled with debates about precedent and reform. A respected professor at the University of Wisconsin wrote an op-ed titled "The Crockett Standard: Why We Must Rethink How We Teach Law." A conservative think tank released a statement calling the panel concerned, though they had to admit Crockett had presented her arguments articulately and forcefully. But Jasmine wasn't glued to the reactions. She spent the day back in her Dallas office, sorting through casework. Her chief of staff knocked on the door mid-afternoon. "You're booked on 3 shows next week. Also, someone from Georgetown Law wants to bring you in for a guest lecture." Jasmine looked up from her files. "Do they want a speech or a conversation?" They said, "Whatever you're willing to give." She leaned back in her chair. "Tell them I'll come, but I want to talk to students, not just stand behind a podium." While the buzz kept building, the people who mattered most to her, the ones without Twitter accounts, the ones juggling 2 jobs and unpaid traffic tickets, had begun to notice too. An elderly woman named Roberta in Dayton called her granddaughter, in tears. "Baby, that black lady in the blue suit. She said exactly what I've been thinking my whole life. I didn't know they let people like her speak like that." It wasn't just about the courtroom anymore. It was about permission to be heard, to be brilliant, to refuse the boxes people put you in. Even Justice Sotomayor, a week after the panel, made an unscheduled stop at a youth legal clinic in Newark. When asked by a student if she thought change was possible and how the law treats communities of color, she paused before answering. "There's a woman named Jasmine Crockett," she said. "Look her up." What started as a subtle challenge on a panel had become a reminder that brilliance isn't housed in tradition. Sometimes it walks in from the margins, file folder in hand, carrying stories that never make it to casebooks, but should have. Back in her office, Jasmine finally sat alone for the first time that day. Her phone buzzed with another request, but she let it ring. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a yellowed index card, one she'd written in law school, taped to her desk during finals. It said, "Make them see it, not just the law, the lives inside it." She smiled at it, just briefly, but in all the noise and headlines, what remained was the truth that had powered the moment. When you speak from real experience, you don't need to prove your worth. The room adjusts. A week after the panel, things had quieted, at least on the surface. The news cycle moved on, as it always does, chasing something louder or messier, but something from that moment still lingered in unexpected places. In a community college classroom in Toledo, a second-year student studying criminal justice replayed the panel clip for the third time, pausing to jot notes in the margins of a beat-up binder. He'd been told more than once that he didn't look like a lawyer. That day, he started sketching out a transfer application to Howard Law. At a juvenile court in Akron, a young public defender cited Galt during a motion to suppress. When the judge pushed back, she referenced Crockett's remarks directly. "I'd like to remind the court," she said, "that precedent can evolve. These weren't headlines. These were quiet fires being lit where they were needed most." Back in Washington, Jasmine sat in a committee hearing on housing justice. Same tone, same clarity. But this time you could feel that more people were listening differently. Her presence didn't surprise them anymore. It challenged them to pay closer attention. After the hearing, a young staffer walked up nervously. "Ms. Crockett, I just wanted to say that what you did at that panel, it meant a lot. Not just the cases, but the way you didn't back down. You showed us how to fight without yelling." Jasmine thanked her and moved on, not because it didn't matter, but because she had work to do. And the work wasn't about one panel or one clip. It was about shifting the expectation of who gets to speak with authority and be taken seriously when they do. Justice Sotomayor, in a brief appearance on a law school live stream weeks later, was asked what she thought about generational divides in legal thought. She answered without hesitation, "I think sometimes those of us who've been in this system a long time forget how much we still have to learn, especially from people who didn't come up the same way." That was it. No direct mention, but everyone who had watched the panel knew who she was talking about. Jasmine Crockett didn't set out to embarrass anyone that day. She didn't show up to prove she belonged. She already knew she did. What she offered, through law, through story, through unflinching calm, was a lesson in presence. There's power in not raising your voice when the truth is already loud enough. Power in speaking plainly when the room expects performance. And power in saying, "This is how the law feels when it hits people without a cushion." We spend a lot of time asking who deserves to be in the room, but maybe the better question is, what kind of room do we deserve if we only listen to voices that sound like our own? If there's anything to carry forward from what happened that day, it's this. Titles don't make the voice matter. The story behind it does. So here's your takeaway. Never let someone's position convince you that your perspective is less valid. If you've lived it, if you've studied it, if you've survived it, you're